So now what I'd like to do is convert this to a smart object, then grab it with my moving tool and just drag it out and then dump it here. And I think that would be long enough. So I'm going to delete this layer, then select this one, Control T or Command T if you're on a Mac. Holding down Shift, I'm going to scale it down. And I think this length is quite enough. So I'm going to do Enter. And then we could either go in and edit the smart object. And if you close that tab, you could just double click this and it would open it. And then we could crop it. Or if we want to keep it that length in case we need it somewhere else, that length, whatever, we can just add a mask here. So I'm going to take my lasso tool and we can end it around here. But let's end it with that nice flower. So I'm going to zoom up, Control plus, and then do this, and holding down the spacebar, navigate down, and then back up here, click, then take my paint bucket tool, on black, add a mask, and let's click Alt-click on the mask, then Control-I to invert it, and then Alt-click again. And then as for this little piece here, we could either take our brush on 100% opacity and just brush over it while on the mask with a black color. Or if we had had a mask before and then used the lasso, we could have just used the paint bucket and clicked in there and it would have all turned black and disappeared. Alright, so there we've got our trim. Now how do we make it follow this rounded curve? Well, for that we need to Control T, transform it again, and then I'm going to warp it. I'm going to apply, escape, apply first the layer mask. And if we can't apply the layer mask, then we can just convert it to a smart object and then it has the mask in there. And then what I'm going to do is Control T and then warp. And I'm going to zoom up closer so I can better see what I'm doing. And basically I'm just going to move it to follow that curved outline. Something like that might work, so let's do Enter and then zoom out. Control J to duplicate the layer, then Control T to transform it, right click, flip horizontally, and bring it to the other side. And then I'm going to transform it one more time, this time with a warp, and zoom up to the bottom part here, and just separate those flowers a touch. And then the same thing to the other side. Warp. And something like that. You could add a different flower here if you wanted to, or do some other design. Okay, so now we've got this trim going around the neck part, and then all I'm going to do is hide all these other layers except for this one. And we don't need the document to be so big, so I'm going to crop it up to here, Enter, and then I'm going to go File, Save As, I'll stick it on my desktop again, and I'll call this Floral Trim, and I'm going to save it as a PNG. Floral trim around neck. Okay, then back in here in Marvelous, I'm going to click my 2D graphic tool, go to my desktop, and find my floral trim, double click that, then click here, say OK, show my textures, and then position it onto my dress. You can also use your arrow keys to nudge it left or right, and if you go to 2D pattern window properties, you can set the arrow key movements in millimeters. I like to set it to 1, for more control. Now, it's usually better to have one 2D graphic for your designs rather than many little ones, because for instance, when I export it to rendered in Keyshot, you can see that it doesn't read the ping like MD does, in the way that it should be transparent here. It reads it like it has a white background, so we need to double click on that fabric, then go into textures, and in the opacity, load in recent places, that same PNG, and then set that instead of color to alpha. And instead of box map to UV coordinates and then back in color, sync that as well. And then we get it with a transparent background. Now if we had to do that for all of the many little pieces, that becomes a real pain in the butt. So best to have it as one piece, then you just need to do this work once. And the same I found also works in Octane render, and I don't know other render engines, but I think it's best to have it as one piece. And the same goes if you wanted to apply a trim across this part between the dark and the lighter part. To find out what width to make it, I would just take my rectangular pattern tool and measure it like that. And that is 347, let's say. So I'll delete that and then go back in Photoshop, File New, 347 by 20. And then to make a different trim pattern, again we have to first open it up and then say Edit, Define Pattern, then go back to this one here, double click the background layer to make it a layer 0, then double click that again, Pattern Overlay. Here we go, we can adjust it, something like that, and it doesn't matter there's a bit of white because it's actually a transparent background, so when we take the fill down, then there won't be any white. And then we'll go File, Save As, Desktop, Trim to, PNG, oops, I said cancel instead of save. And save. Okay. And then it's pretty simple, we just go here, click this tool, find our trim, and then place it. And there we go with a pretty trim here. Then if you want to put it on the back, then you can just select it, copy, find the back pattern, and then paste it there. Now the texture in the back is actually a bit higher, so I'm going to move it down so it aligns nicely. Let's hide the sleeve, Shift Q, and this one, Shift Q, and then we can better see what's going on. Then take our trim, and there we go, that looks nice, and this texture has to move down a touch. Alright, so when you need to put trims, overlay trims, on parts of clothing that are rounded and not straight, or on top of the middle of clothing, then the 2D graphics tool is really the best way to do that. Otherwise, it's fastest if you want to add trims to the bottoms of clothes or the bottoms of sleeves, to simply, let's hide the textures a second, see how long that bottom part is, then take your rectangular pattern tool, click once, type in the same width, 338, it doesn't have to be with the 0.73, but you can if you want to be particular, and then the height that you want, so let's make it 20, and then take our segment sew tool and sew that together, and then add a fabric and call this trim bottom, and then load in a texture which will be our trim. And I'm going to take actually a lace trim and show our textures, and then drop it onto this part here, take my texture transform tool and scale it. And then take my edit pattern tool and lift this line up to make it a bit shorter. Zoom out, select this pattern, right click, superimpose over. And there it is. And as usual, we can change the color in it if we wanted to. Make it more purple, more pink. And then if we simulate, it will connect itself nicely to that. And there we've got the trim sitting on the bottom. Now I can see there's a bit of a gap. As you see here, there's a bit of a gap too where the texture is, so let's move that up a touch. And then it looks like it's connecting a bit better. Here the texture is coming from the bottom, so let's move that up a bit too. And usually it also works if the bottoms of your fabric are curved. So for instance, I'll take my curve tool and I'll curve this downwards, like sometimes when you have flared skirts or skirts which are just long and have a lot of material, they have a rounded design on the bottom. Let's move this down and then simulate. So there it's simulated, and you can see it's still following along the bottom even though it's curved. Now if you have something that's going in zigzags or weird curves, then it's going to be a bit difficult to sew a straight pattern onto that, and then your best bet is simply to make a screenshot of the pattern, take it into Photoshop and use the warp to transform your trim to be any weird zigzag or wavy design that you need it to be. Now if you have a trim like this, you may not want it to start from the very bottom. You may want it to look like it's actually sitting on the dress or skirt and starting off from here, not sewing on from the tip, which doesn't look very realistic. But if you lift it up from here, then you're cutting it. So how we solve that is we take our edit sewing tool, select the sewing here, hit the delete button, then take our edit pattern tool, and let's just hide our textures for a moment. Select this line, right click, offset as internal line, and I think 5 should be about right, but let's try 8. Okay, then take our segment sewing tool and sew this onto here. And then when we simulate, you can see that it's not starting off from the bottom, but is actually sitting on top of the dress and then hanging down from there. And here I can see there's a pink line. Let's see our texture. Zoom up close. Take our texture transform tool. And actually it's not the texture, again, it's the side settings. So let's go to the side settings, turn off same materials front, delete our texture. And if you don't want to see anything on the side, like for instance in this example just a pink color is still disturbing, then the best thing to do is to go to the side and to load in a texture. I'll go to my desktop, which is simply a transparent pink. So I went into Photoshop, I made a new document, a small square, and I just had it with a transparent background, nothing on it, and then I saved it out as a pink with transparency. So if we bring that in, you can see now we don't see the side at all, because it has a texture that doesn't have anything on it, but transparent nothingness. And there, we don't see that pink side thing. Now sometimes when you apply a trim, some part of it decides that it should go beneath your skirt, and you can try tugging at it, but that's sometimes frustrating because it goes under again. So the best thing to do is simply select it, and here in the layer number, type 1, press enter, and it comes out nicely. And then once it's out of your skirt and sitting like you want it to sit, Marvelous recommends that you put it back to 0. So we'll do that. And there we go. So that's basically how to add trims, and I hope that helps you.